Hey, before we start this episode, if you're looking for a nerdy personal finance Christmas present, look no further. I'm giving away 25 gifts to my audience this holiday season. Listeners here know that I give away a super soft podcast t-shirt every episode. More shirts are coming your way, but if you're not a shirt person, don't worry. I'm also happy to send you one of my top 5 financial planning and investing books. So you can either get a super soft t-shirt or a great book for Christmas. There are 3 free ways for you to enter, and yes, you can enter more than once. In short, the 3 ways are: you can leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a rating and comment on a Spotify episode of the podcast, or you can share a link to my blog or to this podcast or to a specific episode of the podcast on your preferred social media channel. And then just shoot me a screenshot of your review or of you sharing it online. Just send me a screenshot to enter your name. You can email your screenshot to jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, a rating and review on Apple, or a rating and comment on Spotify, or sharing via social media, and then you can email me a screenshot. I'll track all the entries and announce the winners next week. I'll reach out to you and you can let me know if you'd prefer a shirt or one of the books. Happy holidays.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 124. I'm Jesse Kramer. By day, I work at a fiduciary wealth management firm helping clients nationwide. You can learn more at bestinterest.blog/work. The link is in the show notes. By night, I write the Best Interest blog and I host this podcast. I also put out a weekly email newsletter, all of which help busy professionals and retirees avoid mistakes and grow their wealth by simplifying their investing, taxes, and retirement planning. And today is our 11th AMA Ask Me Anything episode. I'll answer questions today about picking a 15-year versus a 30-year mortgage or vice versa, when it makes sense to stop funding a health savings HSA account or to start using that account to refund your own past medical expenses. Third, an interesting specific question about balancing Roth conversions, ACA healthcare premiums, and capital gains. How do you balance these different interests in any given tax year without accidentally shooting yourself in the tax foot, as it were? And last, should a confirmed DIYer or a confirmed Boglehead even consider hiring a financial advisor? But first, we'll do a quick review of the week. This one comes from Weather Guy number 2, who says, 5-star review, excellent personal finance insights and perspective. Thank you, Jesse, for your well-thought-out information and content. I'm so glad I found your blog and podcast. Your deep dives on the most relevant and important money and estate planning concepts and ideas are insightful and delivered in a way that is easier to understand for both the novice and experienced DIYer. I truly appreciate the time you put into this and your wise counsel. Keep up the great work. Well, Weather Guy, thank you very much for those kind words, and a super soft podcast t-shirt can go your way in the mail, Weather Guy. Please just drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog. Send me your shirt size and the mailing address, and we will get you a super soft podcast t-shirt sent out your way. Thank you, Weather Guy. And now on to our first AMA question. John G. wrote in and asked, why should you pick a 15-year mortgage over a 30-year mortgage and vice versa? So first, let's start with some obvious trade-offs, or at least the things that most consumers would notice right away. A 15-year mortgage comes with all the following. Usually it has a lower interest rate. And if you combine that lower interest rate with the half the loan term, right, 15 years against 30 years, there are 2 obvious reasons why the 15-year mortgage would involve significantly less interest overall. A 30-year mortgage, here's just an example, a 30-year mortgage at a 6% interest rate that borrows $400,000. So that'll just be our baseline. 30 years, 6% rate, $400,000 of borrowing. You'll obviously pay the $400,000 in principal back, but that loan is also going to end up including $463,000 in interest. A 15-year mortgage, though, at that same 6%, it doesn't even have the lower interest rate, even though we know it probably would. But if we just assume the same exact 6% interest rate, also borrowing $400,000, that loan is only going to have $207,000 of interest payments. $207,000. And again, that was against $463,000 for the first mortgage. But the payments themselves on a 15-year mortgage are higher because you only have half the payments to repay the full loan. So again, if we look at the same loan as above, the 30-year loan that we quoted above would have a $2,400 per month payment in principal and interest, while the 15-year loan has a $3,400 per month payment. $2,400 on the 30-year loan, $3,400 on the 15-year loan. And that means that your monthly household cash flow is certainly more negatively impacted during those 15 years. And therefore, a buyer or borrower would risk defaulting on the loan if they cannot keep up with those monthly payments. And since the monthly payment is higher for a 15-year loan, 15-year mortgage, financial planners consider it, to some extent, an extra forged savings. In other words, instead of taking the monthly savings from a 30-year mortgage and investing the funds into a money market account or the stock market, you're essentially taking your extra money every month and you're investing it in your house, which over the long run is likely to appreciate. So maybe that'll turn out to be a good thing. And that also means that the 15-year mortgage has less affordability. If your family limit on household spending is $2,500 per month, period, well, that's the maximum payment that you can afford to make. And the longer your mortgage, the more house you could afford for that same $2,500 per month payment. And actually just now, I haven't dug into the details of this at all. I'm recording this on Sunday, November 9th. And I think some news stories about this particular topic came out on Friday, November 7th, involving 50-year mortgages and something President Trump, I think, wants to standardize some sort of 50-year mortgage. And whether good or bad, that same $2,500 per month payment over 50 years could buy you even more house than a 30-year mortgage could. It's just a matter of if you want to be in that level of housing debt for 50 years or 30 years or 15 years or 10 years or not at all. So I do want to go down a slightly different argument right now on this mortgage debate, and I call it the invest the difference argument. And the argument goes like this. So let's revisit our scenario earlier where a 15-year mortgage required $3,400 per month payments and our 30-year mortgage required $2,400 per month payments. And let's imagine two people, one in each scenario. They're paying off their mortgage, but they're also long-term investors like all of us listening. And they're looking to put some of their money to work for the long run in some sort of long-term investments. And you can compare these two people and you could say, well, in years 1 through 15, the lower payment, the $2,400 per month payment, it's $1,000 lower than the $3,400 per month payment. That might allow that person to invest an extra $1,000 per month that the 15-year mortgage borrower, they just don't have that extra $1,000 a month right now. So for the first 15 years, having the 30-year mortgage allows you to save and invest an extra $1,000 per month. But then in years 16 through 30, the 15-year mortgage has stopped. That higher monthly payment has stopped. And thus that allows the first borrower with a 15-year mortgage to quickly catch up to some extent, right? They can plow the full $3,400 a month that was going to their mortgage. Now they can start investing that. And meanwhile, the second borrower, the 30-year mortgage, they're kind of still stuck at that $1,000 per month investment amount. We can look at these two kind of compounded returns over the full 30 years, and we could vary our anticipated investment returns, or we could vary the actual interest rates on the mortgages too, which would affect the monthly payment portions, or at least the way the two monthly payments compare to one another. And we could ask, does one of these two investors end up in a better spot after 30 years? Does having the 30-year mortgage, which allows you to start putting more money away sooner in some sort of investment account, does that end up doing better than the 15-year mortgage? And it's worth doing any sort of precise math for your specific situation. But if I look at the situation and I assume mortgage rates about where they are today, which is 6%, and I assume long-term stock market averages, which is a 10% nominal return, we can use that. I will say I've recently published an article where I'm more and more inclined to use something more like an 8% nominal return. It's up for debate. But in either case, pick your number based on kind of the assumptions that you want to bake into your financial plan. And yes, this is a situation where the mortgage rate is fixed. It's not affected by inflation. And so the investment returns should also be not affected by inflation, which is why we want to use nominal returns here, not real returns. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of preamble, I know, the math becomes pretty stark and pretty clear. The person with the 30-year mortgage actually comes out on top because they were able to put more money to work for the long run from an earlier age. And I think this should kind of make sense because it's as simple as this. Would you rather put more money toward a 6% loan where you know your return is a guaranteed 6%, or would you rather put that money toward an investment that I just told you, right? I have dictated in my spreadsheet will return 8 or 9 or 10% per year. The choice is just as obvious as I've defined it, right? 10% or 9% or 8% is all bigger than 6%. So I would rather put money toward an investment that I am saying will return 8 or 9 or 10% per year instead of putting that extra money toward a 6% loan. Now, of course, the hard part and the nuance and the real devil is in the details, because we realize that the 10% stock market return or 8% is simply not guaranteed. The question then becomes, how confident do you want to be that the stock market will return that 8, 9, 10% per year over the next 30 years when we really zoom out? Or even how confident you want to be that the stock market will return 7% per year over the next 30 years, because the math still works out well if we choose to compare a 6% return from loan repayment versus a 7% return from an investment. And then we need to take that math, and I think we need to layer on top of that math the feeling of debt. This one is certainly personal. As I speak into this microphone, I am many hundreds of thousands of dollars in mortgage debt. And yet I don't really feel that bad about it. I don't lose sleep over it. To me, I see my mortgage payments as a form of rent. And I see my emergency fund as being able to pay that rent for many, many months if it needs to. And while I would love to be free of that debt, I mean, who wouldn't want to be free of debt? I don't necessarily feel a burning desire to rid myself of it. Kind of, my brain is at this all in good time perspective. That's how I feel about it. It'll be paid off in good time. But other people don't feel that way about their debt. Some people are truly allergic to debt, like oil and water. They do lose sleep over debt, no matter the interest rate. And to that person, I'm not sure if my investment math from a couple minutes ago will do them any good. To them, that 15-year mortgage, get out of debt ASAP, that's the clear path to them. And ultimately, I don't see any major issues with that. It's just like when, some retirees are comfortable with a 70-30 portfolio. Others would rather have a 50-50 portfolio. Maybe others want to have a 30-70 portfolio. I mean, we know the math, right? We know that one is very likely, not definitely, but very likely to outperform the other over the long run. One of those three investors is certainly likely to be less volatile than the other two over the long run. We know that one of those retirees will likely be able to outspend, outgive, outbequest the others. And does that make one portfolio right and another one wrong? I don't really think so, as long as we know going in, kind of eyes wide open, how our choices are going to affect our long-term outcomes. And back to mortgages, we should also talk about liquidity. I think that's an important topic, something I've seen written about and spoken about plenty. So it's not like I'm inventing a new idea here, but I do think it's something that most of the 101 info doesn't seem to cover. So let's say you have $50,000 in your bank account in your emergency fund. You owe $200,000 still on your mortgage. And you're asking yourself, should you use some of the $50K to pay down that mortgage? Now, on the one hand, you're reducing your debt. Yep, you're reducing your future interest payments. Terrific. That's great. But on the other hand, you are taking a very liquid part of your personal balance sheet and you are transferring it to an illiquid part of your balance sheet. In other words, it's very easy to turn cash into home equity, but it's not nearly as easy to turn that home equity back into cash. And I know HELOCs exist, home equity loans exist for sure. It's certainly not impossible to turn home equity back into cash at all. But before you ever throw extra money at your mortgage, I do think it's worth asking, do I have any liquidity needs that I can think of? Is this truly excess cash wasting away on my balance sheet? Or here's another great litmus test question, and that is, do I need to make this extra mortgage payment right now? Or would I simply feel more comfortable waiting 3 months, 6 months, 12 months before making the extra payment? Because the mortgage is still going to be there a year from now. And the impact from the extra payment will still be really strong, really great if I wait this extra 12 months. Do I feel so comfortable making the extra mortgage payment right now that I'll go ahead and do it? Or would I feel considerably more comfortable by waiting 12 months? I think that's an important question to ask yourself. And in a parallel way, taking a 15-year mortgage is akin to making extra forced mortgage payments every single month. You are intentionally making yourself less liquid for the next 15 years. That can be totally reasonable and totally okay, but you want to think about it first. So, John, thank you for the excellent question. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I send a free weekly email to thousands of readers that shares 2 simple things, just 2. The first are my new articles and podcasts, so you'll never miss when I publish new content. And the second is my favorite financial content from other corners of the internet, so you can see what's been helping me the most.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
I hear you. I make this newsletter short, sweet, and full of essential information, and readers enjoy that. About 85% of newsletter subscribers are engaging with the newsletter more than once a month. They're enjoying it, and you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog, and you'll get a free PDF of my white paper titled The Step-by-Step Guide to Building Your Retirement Paycheck. That's right, a free weekly email that thousands of people like you are already reading, a free white paper to help you plan for retirement, and you can sign up for free at bestinterest.blog. Now moving on, both Jeff and Tad had similar smart questions about HSA accounts. Essentially, their questions boil down to, when does it make sense to stop funding an HSA account and or to start using that account to actually pay for your medical expenses or refund your own past medical expenses? And for some background, of course, there is a little bit of an assumption built into this question, but it's a very reasonable assumption. And that assumption is that there is a quote unquote best way to use an HSA health savings account. Many people might think to use their HSA as a place to make tax-free deposits. Yep, we all know that. And then use that money to pay the near-term current medical bills. We've got a daughter here at home and she goes to the doctor, and my wife and I, we go to the doctor. And so some people would say, oh, max out your HSA, Jesse, $8,550 for a couple this year in 2025. And then just turn around and immediately use some of that money just to pay your medical bills. And that's fine. You're still getting that tax-free deposit up front, which is great. But a numerically better way of using an HSA, at least historically, involves depositing that money into that account, tax-free, excellent, investing that money, and then waiting, right? Investing that money because the HSA is a tax-free growth account, just like your 401k or IRAs are. There's no annual taxes on any sort of capital gains or interest or dividends in the account. Awesome. And then we wait, we let those investments grow. And again, they do so tax-free. And then some years or even decades down the road, you could use today's HSA dollars that you save today for those future medical bills. And the capital gains, again, on your investments are totally free at that point, right? You can withdraw money for a qualified need in the future, totally tax-free. And the best part, and this is kind of that secret tech that some people know about and some people don't, is that you can save medical receipts during the interim years and decades and then retroactively reimburse your past expenses using HSA money. You can keep that in your back pocket during retirement, especially if you happen to be close for some sort of income cliff, like whether it's a state cliff, an IRMA threshold, an ACA threshold, something like that. If you need some extra money in retirement or maybe in your early retirement years, one thing you could potentially do is reimburse yourself from your HSA using past receipts that you have saved, thus injecting some extra cash flow into your life from your HSA, totally tax-free, by reimbursing yourself for previous expenses, previous medical expenses. Thus, you've kind of solved your in-year cash flow need without realizing any extra taxes and therefore without pushing yourself above whatever income cliff you were worried about. That's pretty sweet. But there's a possible downside here. And I should say there's a possible downside with the HSA account in general. And this downside is going to steer us back toward the heart of the question. When does it make sense to stop funding an HSA or to start using the HSA to refund your own medical expenses? And the downside is the risk of dying with HSA money on your balance sheet. And of course, this requires the caveat that always exists, which is that dying stinks for many, many reasons, and money shouldn't really be that far up the top of the list. But the show is about financial planning and long-term investing. So of course, we're going to talk about it from the money angle. If you have complaints about that, I get it. Thank you in advance. And you can send your complaints to screamintothevoid@bestinterest.blog. That's the email address for all of our complaints. Like many qualified accounts, you need to name a beneficiary on your HSA. Now, for many married people, they will name their spouse. Makes sense. And that's fine, because if your spouse inherits your HSA, nothing really changes. They get to use the HSA funds the same way before and after your death. And by the way, HSA funds can be used for any medical expenses in your direct family, whether yours, a spouse's medical expenses, or a child, assuming that child is a tax dependent. So that tax dependency test really is the metric of merit when it comes to who can use your HSA funds for their medical bills. But back to the whole beneficiary thing. So again, as we said, not a big deal if your beneficiary is your spouse. They get to use the HSA the same exact way you would have. But what if you don't have a spouse anymore? What if your spouse inherits your HSA, but then they die and they leave the HSA to another heir, say a grandchild or just one of your children or a grandchild or something like that, just a non-spouse heir. When a non-spouse heir inherits an HSA, the account ceases to be an HSA on the date of the owner's death, and the entire fair market value is included in the beneficiary's taxable income for that year. The beneficiary must pay ordinary income tax on the full amount. So in case that kind of flew over your head because it was all a bunch of, tax and estate planning jargon. You've got $50,000 in an HSA. You leave it to your son and you die. On the day you die, the entire $50,000 HSA moves to your child as taxable money, no longer as HSA money, but as taxable money. And it's all $50,000 are considered taxable income to your child all in that 1 year. There's no 10-year rule like there would be with an IRA. It's all taxable money all at once. So that is a lot of unintended taxable income for your heir. And it might essentially entirely negate all of the tax benefit that you realized from your HSA in the first place, because we're taking some of what otherwise would have been lower capital gains tax rates on your HSA growth. You are negating capital gains taxes inside of the HSA wrapper. But now we're taking all of those gains and we're charging higher income rates to your heir on those same dollars. So you might totally negate all of the tax benefits realized by the HSA and then some. And your heir might end up paying more in taxes than you ever would have if you'd like put the money in a taxable account in the first place. Like, we're kind of flirting with that territory here. And I will say, I did learn one interesting workaround as I researched this question more, just in case it ever happens to you or someone you know. The beneficiary can use, so again, let's go back to that example and say your child is inheriting the HSA. Your child is the beneficiary. So in this case, the child, your beneficiary, your child, can use the inherited HSA dollars to pay the deceased person's medical bills, almost as if the deceased person were using their own HSA for their own benefit. And I think that passes the common sense test. The beneficiary, therefore, gets a tax deduction for those dollars used in this way. And again, that passes the common sense test. So as an example, someone dies with a $50,000 medical bill and $50,000 in an HSA. In the worst case scenario, the hospital bill would get paid by the estate of the deceased person using their taxable dollars. And then the HSA passes to the beneficiary and is all taxed as income. So that's the worst case scenario, kind of taxable on both ends. But in the best case scenario, the hospital bill gets paid using the HSA dollars. You know, the beneficiary has to step up to the plate and make that payment. And the erstwhile $50,000 in the taxable estate stays in the estate to be distributed out at a stepped-up basis. You could say there's a weird thing going on here. The beneficiary is likely just one person, whereas the estate might be distributed out to many people. So will the one beneficiary decide to be utilitarian and use the HSA in this way, thereby saving all the other estate inheritors some serious tax money? This is the corner within the corner within the corner case. You know, we're deep inside the daddy long leg spider web at the back of the attic at this point, but I digress. Let's work our way back out of this HSA inception. So ideally, we do not want to pass HSA assets down to our non-spouse heirs. I'll say that again. Ideally, we do not want to pass HSA assets down to our non-spouse heirs. Therefore, the inspiring question here makes a lot of sense. When does it make sense to stop funding an HSA account and start using that account to refund your own medical expenses? Most people listening are maybe within 5 to 10 years of retirement or in retirement itself. So I think it's important to point out to all of you listening, HSA money can pay for Medicare premiums. HSA money can pay for most long-term care costs. HSAs can pay for most long-term care insurance premiums. However, HSA money cannot pay for ACA Obamacare premiums. That's an important difference. Now, some of you might think you've heard something recently that sounds to the contrary of this, but what you've heard is that many bronze and lower ACA plans are now HSA eligible, meaning that you can save money in an HSA within that plan, almost like it was a high deductible health plan, but you can't use the HSA money to pay the insurance premium itself. So again, Medicare, yes. Long-term care costs, yes. Long-term care insurance, yes. ACA, no. COBRA health insurance, in case you're on COBRA, the answer is yes. You can use HSA money to pay COBRA costs. Here's another really valuable stat, and this one comes from KFF, a terrific healthcare think tank. And this comes from back in 2022, so we can maybe inflate this number a little bit. But the stat is that the average Medicare beneficiary, so again, this is someone 65 years or older on Medicare, the average Medicare beneficiary spent a total of $6,300 on out-of-pocket healthcare costs, and that includes their Medicare premiums. So if we inflate it up to today, maybe we round up, we're probably going to get something closer to like $7,000 a year in healthcare costs. And that's out of pocket, again, including Medicare premiums. what I take that to mean to some extent is that between age, say 65 and 85, it's not unreasonable to assume that someone might be paying $140,000, $150,000 in out-of-pocket costs per person. And again, this is just the average. Some of us will be lower, especially if we're on the healthier end. I know that some of us will be higher. I get it. But I'm just saying that because if you're sitting here at age 55, you have $100,000 saved up in your HSA account, I do think you have some interesting choices in front of you. One of those choices asks, are you going to be that average person or that average couple who might spend $140,000 per person on out-of-pocket healthcare costs in retirement? Now, personally, I believe in game theory, and the game theory for most of our investment accounts is, well, if I die, then the next person in line inherits something as good, if not better, than what I had in terms of tax treatment. But as we discussed, that is not the case for HSA accounts. Therefore, I would encourage us to heavily lean toward securing HSA reimbursements earlier in life. Now, how early? Probably depends on your health a little bit, depends on your spouse's health a little bit. Option one is, use your HSA for your kids and not that much for investment growth. That's fine. It's fine. A spreadsheet will tell you that it's not mathematically ideal, but life isn't lived inside a spreadsheet. Option two is to try to pay current medical bills out of pocket and letting your HSA compound until age X, and then you reimburse yourself. Well, what exactly is age X? I'm going to say right here that for me, and if a client was asking me this today, I would say age X is your late 50s. And I'm trying to be a little bit of that, aerospace engineer like I was in my former career here, because we're already deep in the corner of a corner case. And if we look at mortality data, your late 50s is when mortality data grows from kind of this very de minimis and linear growth to a more noticeable and actually exponential growth. And by the time 65 and 70 arrive, the mortality graph is curving up pretty hard. And because we want to avoid dying with unspent HSA dollars, I'd rather not see any sort of significant HSA balance by that age. And again, this doesn't mean that the average person is going to die by 65 or 70. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that the game theory to me says we don't want to die with an HSA. So once mortality starts becoming more and more and more realistic, I would rather not have an HSA on my balance sheet anymore. If you're still working and still contributing to an HSA at that age 65 or 70, that's totally fine. I would just recommend spending down that balance to a reasonable degree every single year. If you're 65 and still working and still contributing to an HSA, I don't think you need to save your receipts and let the HSA grow anymore, right? I think you're capturing a great tax advantage on the front end. Maybe you've been capturing it for decades and decades and decades, and now you just need to go ahead and spend that money. So back to the original question askers, Jeff and Tad, I hope those thoughts help you guys out. Let me know what you think. Question 3 is from Allison, and I think it's kind of an interesting question. I wanted to share with it because I want you all to get a little bit of a glimpse inside of some real financial planning and to get a glimpse inside the problem-solving process and some of the communication and the back and forth and some of the talk around cause and effect. Because there are lots of causes and effects in our financial lives, and I think you'll see that here with Allison. So Allison wrote into me and, she said, thank you. She heard me on Choose FI originally. Awesome. She has a question for my AMA. Allison and her husband retired early, not crazy early. She's 57, he's 61. They're selling a rental property in 2026. Okay, so here's an important point. They want to sell a rental property in 2026. So the capital gains from that rental property will blow up the chances of their income coming in below the 400% poverty level in order to get ACA premium tax credits. And she knows that their ACA premiums will be about $3,000 a month in 2026. Ugh, that's her words. Ugh. And they're going to try to come in under that income threshold in the years after 2026 up until they're 65. Why 65? Well, that's when Medicare kicks in. So Allison's question is, since they don't have to worry about trying to keep their income below that ACA cliff in 2026, she's kind of saying she's thrown in the towel. The capital gains from the house are going to blow up that income cliff for her. So since she knows she's going to be after that income cliff, are there other moves they might want to make in 2026? She's thinking about Roth conversions or taking some IRA distributions so she has spending money during the years when she needs to keep her income low. Thanks for any thoughts you might have. So I had some questions for her because at the end of the day, even though her question was so detailed, which it really was, we still need to collect all of the puzzle pieces before we can really begin providing good financial planning answers. And anytime in your lives, I know a lot of you are DIYers, Anytime you want to answer a real question about your financial plan, you really can't approach it just from one angle. You need to take all of the financial plan into account every single time. That's why I've used this analogy before, that financial plans are kind of like spider webs where everything's interconnected. And sometimes you're tugging on the web over here and you really think you're only going to have an effect over on this one side of the web. And you don't realize you're pulling all the little strands all over the web and you don't know where you might break something on the other side of the web, actually. So what did I reach out to Allison and ask her in response? Well, I asked her specifically, how much in capital gains are you expecting from this home sale? I also asked her if she's aware of depreciation recapture, because that's a different type of real estate tax that many people aren't aware of when it comes to selling a second property or selling some sort of rental property. I asked her, if not for the home sale, what would she expect her AGI, that's line 11 of the 1040 federal tax return, what would she expect her AGI to be for 2026, depending on life circumstances? And I told her that this year's tax return might be a good proxy for that. And the last question I asked her, and I was being nosy into her lifestyle, I was curious if she was aware of the last 2 years in 5 rule, if that could possibly be a creative solution for her problem. And if you don't know that, to avoid capital gains on the sale of a house, you must have owned and used it as your primary residence for at least 2 of the previous 5 years leading up to the sale. It's called the 2 and 5 rule. And sometimes, especially if someone maybe has a second home or they move out of primary home, they start using it as a rental, and then they go to a second home. It's important to think, well, if you've lived in the house for 2 of the last 5 years, you can totally negate any capital gains. Does that mean you move back into the house for 2 years? Maybe. What's usually a lot easier is you just sell the house within the first 5 years after you've left it. Or you just make sure that you sell the house quickly after you move out to avoid those capital gains. Allison was nice enough to respond, and she was familiar with the 2 and 5 year rule, but they don't want to live there anymore. Okay, they just want to simplify their lives and be free of the rental. She did have some estimates for capital gains, around $210,000 in capital gains, but she also noted there'll be realtor costs, depreciation recapture, and she was earmarking $35,000 from the sale in order to pay her 2026 ACA cost, which she was estimating at $3,000 a month. That makes sense. As for her adjusted gross income, AGI, she was saying since they're both not working, they can kind of create their own income by taking withdrawals. And between an annuity that her husband receives and some interest income, and Social Security, because she says her husband will start taking Social Security in mid-2026 when he turns 62, they'll probably have a minimum of $80,000 in income without taking any distributions. So then after 2026, they'll be able to easily come in under the ACA cliff. And okay, now she said a couple interesting things here. I know sometimes, at least me, I like to read. I'm better at reading than I am at listening. So I apologize if you're listening to this podcast right now and some of the details were kind of hard to keep track of. But Allison said a couple interesting things in her response. So I wrote back to her and I said, as with all retirement tax situations, this is multifaceted. As I was writing, I was playing around with a 1040 tax calculator. I used Allison's response to make some assumptions in that tax calculator. And I told her I'd recommend that she play around with all the precise numbers for herself or consult an accountant to double check the assumptions that I made. So I made an assumption of $5,000 in taxable interest, $50,000 of annuity payments, all taxable, $20,000 of Social Security, only $17,000 of which is taxable, $50,000 of depreciation recapture, and $160,000 of long-term capital gains. Now, Allison's original question was about Roth conversions in this year. And the set of assumptions that I used for her, all those income assumptions I just made, put her in an interesting place called the 27% tax bracket. It's an interesting place because if you look at federal tax brackets, well, there is no 27% bracket. But here's what's happening actually under the hood. So right now, Allison's interest, annuity, Social Security, and depreciation recapture are all subject to income tax brackets. Now, I will note for those listening, depreciation recapture has some pretty interesting income tax rules and limits, but I don't think those rules will come into play here. And the income in this case, $122,000 minus the $30,000 standard deduction, that $92,000 becomes subject to income tax, placing Allison and her husband in the 12% marginal bracket. Wonderful. Then we layer on top of that the $160,000 in long-term capital gains. Some of those gains will be taxed at 0%, but most will be taxed at 15%. Now, what happens if Allison were to choose to do a Roth conversion? In other words, what happens when we add just one more dollar of taxable income into her tax return, right? Let's just say she does a Roth conversion of $1. The first thing is that dollar of income gets taxed at 12%. Yep, that makes sense. But then also, due to the layering rules, $1 of her capital gains that was previously being taxed at 0 gets pushed up into the 15% bracket. So what actually happens here, this results in 27 cents of new tax on $1 of Roth conversion, or effectively a 27% marginal rate. And that quote unquote 27% bracket will affect Allison for a little while, but then eventually it drops away because all of her capital gains will then be at 15%. There's no more step up from 0 to 15%. And at that point, her marginal income tax bracket will have matured from 12% up to 22%. So she'd likely have $100,000 of space in the 22% bracket to execute Roth conversions, plus any state income tax for her if applicable. And in summary, my belief is that most of her 2026 Roth conversions, if she chose to do them, would incur 27% or 22% taxes on the federal level. But in other future years, if I use those same exact income assumptions as I did before, except I remove the depreciation recapture and I remove the capital gains because those are one-time things from the sale of the house, it appears that she would probably have $50,000 per year of space in the 12% bracket to execute Roth conversions. So is that worth doing something about? I think, to be honest, it probably depends on the size of her traditional IRA and 401k bucket. If it's a huge bucket, then it might be worth accelerating some Roth conversions into 2026. But if it's not a huge bucket, then it probably won't be worth it. I guess when it really comes down to it in that case, I would ask Allison and her husband to, in their financial plan, work all the way out to RMD age and try to give an approximation of what their RMD tax brackets will be. And if their RMD tax brackets are 24%, 32% or higher, yeah, well, then maybe it makes sense for them to accelerate some Roth conversions in 2026. But if they're paying lower taxes on those RMDs in the future, then I don't see the need to do any sort of accelerated Roth conversions in her case. But that's not all. I played around with the assumption that Allison's husband was going to start collecting Social Security in 2026. But I raised my eyebrows at that assumption. I guess what I should say is I included that assumption in all the income numbers so far in this analysis, but I raised my eyebrows at it because considering the extra income from the home sale in 2026, I would have Allison consider delaying, or having her husband consider delaying his Social Security claiming until 2027. I'm just doing some mental math and it's telling me to definitely analyze that trade-off. One more important note actually is that Allison and her husband are probably going to be in the net investment income tax NIIT zone for 2026 due to their AGI being over $250,000. So every dollar of AGI over $250,000 gets hit with an additional 3.8% tax, which makes the whole Roth conversion in 2026 idea even less attractive. And I know that's a lot. Back to you, listeners. I know that's a lot, but those are the kind of considerations and conversations and questions and back and forth and cause and effect that should go into any sort of financial planning question. And I know for a fact that there are plenty of people out there who maybe would look at Allison's circumstances, or what I should say is they would be in Allison's shoes. And they'd say, you know what, at the end of the day, I'm probably going to be okay no matter what. So I'm just going to go with my gut and I'm going to sell this house and I'm going to claim Social Security early and I'm going to do a bunch of Roth conversions too. And that's fine. And it really is fine because in this case, maybe Allison's going to be totally okay either way. But when it comes to actually trying to optimize what we're doing here, again, taking the soft side out of it, all we're trying to do is optimize the numbers. There are ways to optimize those numbers. I mean, that's the point. And if you don't know all the way that these different things interact, and if you don't know all the ways in which your actions might actually be costing you money, well, that's where having some, whether it's improving your own DIY knowledge or leaning on a professional, the fact of the matter is there are better ways to do this than what maybe the average DIYer would think.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews. But I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you.
And speaking of the average DIYer or just the dedicated, the diehard DIYer, the diehard Boglehead, the last question, thank you, Allison, by the way, for the terrific question and the back and forth. But today's last question comes from Craig, who has a simple question. Should a confirmed DIYer or Boglehead still consider consulting with a financial planner? And the short answer is consider it. Sure, you can consider it. Maybe for the longer answer, do you follow through and hire someone? Well, it's certainly not black and white. It's definitely gray. And for a good analogy, I'm going to give a shout out to my Uncle Frank, who lives here near me in Rochester. I would guess that Uncle Frank is in the top 0.1% of amateur hobbyist mechanics anywhere in the world in terms of, he's that guy who takes apart all sorts of engines, motorcycle, car, boat, two-stroke power equipment, etc., just for fun. And then, cleans them, figures out what's wrong, fixes them up, puts them back together. He's an expert mechanic, despite the fact that he's never worked as a mechanic. And I look at Uncle Frank and I say, should he ever hire a mechanic? And the answer is well, maybe in some corner cases, maybe as a small safety check to make sure that the work he's already done was done right. But when it comes to 90% of mechanical issues, like fixing up a car, putting on winter tires, changing your oil, doing your own brake pads, a lot of that kind of complex stuff, the answer for him is no. He doesn't need to hire a mechanic. But then I compare Uncle Frank to another friend of mine, Nick, and Nick is a huge F1 racing fan. He's a big fan of cars and speed. He knows all the European F1 racers. I know 2 of them. He knows all of them. In some ways, Nick is similar to my Uncle Frank in terms of that kind of gearhead, loves the idea of, engines and going fast. But he's also noticeably different because liking engines and liking speed is much different than taking engines apart and putting them back together. And maybe, Nick is the equivalent of someone who enjoys watching CNBC, but has never actually looked at a portfolio himself. And so does Nick need to hire out his car mechanic work? Well, yes, because being a fan of race cars doesn't make you qualified to fix your own car. And when I look at the Boglehead and the DIY and the fire world, I see plenty of Uncle Franks who are true expertise. They know so much despite only really ever having to answer questions about their own situation. But then I also see plenty of Nicks. So does Uncle Frank ever need a financial advisor? Well, let's start by giving the DIY Bogleheads their due. If someone has read the Little Book of Common Sense Investing, they read all the blogs, they understand asset allocation and tax efficiency and the role of low-cost indexing, they can rebalance in their sleep. They roll their eyes when they hear someone say, oh, but my guy says he can routinely beat the market. Well, this side's pretty simple. If a DIYer already has all the knowledge, they know how markets work, what diversification means, they know why fees matter, they value control, right? They like tweaking their spreadsheets and pulling on the levers themselves. That's part of the hobby to them. They distrust conflicts of interest. We all know to be wary of the commission-based products and the free steak dinners and the investment-only relationships in this world. We all know the dark side of sales-driven planning that leads with a product instead of leading with a process. And Bogleheads and DIYers, for the most part, are disciplined, right? A true Boglehead stayed the course in 2008 and in 2020. They're not chasing AI stocks right now. They don't panic when the market drops 30%. If all of that is true, I'm not sure what kind of alpha, what kind of benefit the advisor is going to add. The DIY route works just fine in this case. But for even the savviest Boglehead, there can be some cracks in the armor. I think, for one, there's complexity creep. Once you hit your 50s and 60s, life stops being a really neat spreadsheet. You have to juggle RMDs and Roth conversions and Social Security timing and tax loss harvesting and charitable giving and estate planning and healthcare decisions. And while the simple index portfolio is easy, especially to accumulate, the withdrawal strategy that goes with that and that goes with all those different moving pieces is just a different story. There's behavioral blind spots. Knowing that you should stay the course isn't the same as actually doing it when the market's down 40% and your job feels shaky and the news headlines are kind of screaming at you. A truly good advisor is a behavioral circuit breaker in those cases that stops you from damaging yourself. I think I've told the story before of a reader who reached out to me, or I think a listener actually who reached out to me. certainly a DIYer, Boglehead type person up to this point in her investing career. And she admitted to me that during COVID, she abandoned the market for a good 6 months from, in that March 2020 of COVID, because she saw the way that her personal work world was kind of falling apart around her. And she looked at the tea leaves and said, society is going to really suffer from this. And I do not want to be invested in stocks right now. And it ended up being, a 30 to 40% mistake. So even DIYers and Bogleheads have those behavioral blind spots. The next thing here is coordination. Once you've got a spouse and kids, a business, multiple retirement accounts, you're not really just managing a portfolio, you're managing an entire financial system. And a good financial planner is going to see connections that you might not know about or that you might miss. Life transitions are another great reason to consider hiring somebody, because retirement isn't only a financial shift. It's certainly a big financial shift. It's also a psychological shift. Same thing with selling a business or with losing a spouse or with inheriting big assets. And a good financial planner helps their clients navigate that change, the change itself, right? It's not just the numbers, but it's the change itself. Speaking of spousal loss, actually, that right there is a reason that I've been hired before. Jesse, my health is in question. I'm in charge of the family finances. No offense, I'd never really hire you on my own, Jesse, but I need you for the sake of my spouse so that they have someone that they can work with if and when I die. It's totally reasonable. And then there's just a second pair of eyes can be a really good reason to hire a financial planner. A one-time review, a periodic review that can catch mistakes, a missed tax nuance, a suboptimal asset location, an estate document that is out of sync with what you think it says. Just getting that second pair of eyes can be useful. So when might it make sense? For the DIY investor, an advisor doesn't have to mean handing over the keys, right? It could mean a flat fee or an hourly planner every few years just for a checkup. It could mean a one-time retirement income plan to ensure tax efficiency. It could be a full-time fiduciary partner who can glide your flight in for a smooth, efficient landing while you go relax in the back of the plane. The right question isn't necessarily, do I need an advisor? I think the better question is, what job would I hire an advisor to do? If that job is clear and you find someone who you trust, who can solve your problems, who works hard on your behalf, it can be a really high ROI return on investment decision, even for a Boglehead. Going back earlier to the comparison of my Uncle Frank to Nick, the Nick equivalent here is someone who, they love to log into Fidelity and check their account balance. But to ask them how their cash flow connects to their goals, how various taxes work, how to optimize their withdrawal strategy, or simply to ask them why different asset classes perform differently at different times, to ask them why some stocks go up and others go down, to ask them questions that go deeper than the surface level account numbers. And they reply something like, well, but the S&P is up 16% this year and I own VOO. Like, what's wrong with that? It's not that they're bad investors, because they're not. It's just that Nick and the Nicks of the world don't necessarily see the bigger picture or understand the bigger picture. And it's totally up to them whether to hire an advisor or not. But that is someone who I know can get a ton of help from a good financial planner. So in summary, if you're truly, an Uncle Frank type character, a self-taught expert who, and I think this is actually an interesting barometer or litmus test, is someone who, when you listen to podcasts like mine, or you read or listen to other experts out there, financial planners, people who are doing some of the best work in this space, if you're rarely learning anything new from them, then you might be that true Uncle Frank self-taught expert. And if that's you, I think at most that kind of one-time spot check relationship could do you some good, but it's really up to you. But if you're a Nick who just kind of likes to see your portfolio go up, but then the rest of the actual financial planning world kind of feels like a black box to you, then I think you can gain a lot of good out of a financial planning relationship. And that's coming from some firsthand experience on the other side of the table. So that's my 2 cents. Excellent question, Craig. Does a DIYer, does a Boglehead need a financial planner? Ask yourself, what kind of questions do I want this financial planner to answer for you? And then ask yourself, are you more like an Uncle Frank? Are you more like a Nick? How do you find someone who you can trust all the way down the line? Thank you, because that was a great question. And all you listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. Thank you for writing, just sending in amazing questions. At this point, I will be honest with you, I'm probably getting more questions than I have time to provide answers, at least under this current regime, even though I'm doing one AMA episode every single month. It's just an awesome place to be, and the questions are fantastic. So thank you. Thank you for writing so many amazing reviews and 5-star ratings. And please send your future AMA questions to my email address, jesse@bestinterest.blog.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.